I never imagined my own parents would say those words to my face, that they preferred my sister's children over mine. Yet there I was, frozen in my living room, watching them casually destroy years of pretending we were all equally loved. The silence that followed felt like a physical weight pressing against my chest, and in that moment, I knew nothing between us would ever be the same again. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. It started on what should have been an ordinary Sunday dinner. My home had always been the gathering place for our extended family, a tradition I'd maintained for nearly 7 years. Every third Sunday, without fail, my modest suburban house would transform into a bustling hub of conversation, laughter, and the occasional family drama. I'd spend hours preparing homemade lasagna, my father's favorite, fresh salads, and my specialty garlic bread that my nieces and nephews would fight over. My children, Ethan and Sophie, would excitedly prepare the table, making little name cards and arranging wildflowers they'd picked from our garden. My husband, Mark, had left for a business trip that morning, kissing me goodbye and reminding me not to stress too much about the dinner. "It's just family," he'd said with a reassuring smile, having no idea how those words would turn bitter by nightfall. The day had started so well. Sophie, my 8-year-old daughter, had spent the morning helping me bake an apple pie, her small hands carefully arranging the lattice top with surprising precision for her age. Ethan, who had just turned 11, was proudly setting up a new board game he'd saved his allowance to buy, excited to show his cousins after dinner. My house smelled of rich tomato sauce and baking spices. The dining room table extended to its full length and decorated with Sophie's handmade centerpiece. "Do you think Grandma will like my flower arrangement?" Sophie asked, adjusting a slightly wilted daisy. Her dark curls fell across her face as she concentrated, her tongue poking out slightly between her teeth, a habit she'd had since she was a toddler. "She'll love it, sweetheart," I assured her, although a familiar twinge of doubt crept in. My mother had a talent for finding flaws in everything, especially things made by my children. But I pushed the thought away. Today would be different. It had to be. My parents arrived first, my father carrying a bottle of wine, and my mother immediately scanning the room with her critical gaze. At 72, Eleanor Bishop still maintained her perfectly coiffed silver bob and impeccable clothing, her posture straight as a ruler from years of reminding me to stand up properly, Olivia. Slouching is for people who don't respect themselves. "The house looks comfortable," she said, her standard not quite compliment that I had learned to accept with a tight smile. My father, Robert, more affectionately known as Bob, gave me a genuine hug. He was the softer of my parents, though he rarely contradicted. My mother. "Something smells delicious, Livy," he said, using my childhood nickname that no one else was allowed to use. Sophie rushed forward, proudly pointing to her centerpiece. "Look what I made, Grandma." My mother barely glanced at it. "That's nice, dear. Is that a weed in there? You shouldn't bring weeds inside, they cause allergies." Sophie's smile faltered. It's a wildflower." "Same difference," my mother replied, already moving toward the kitchen to inspect my cooking. Ethan approached next, holding his new board game. "Grandpa, look what I got. Maybe after dinner we could—" "Maybe, son," my father said distractedly, following my mother. I put my arms around both my children, giving them a reassuring squeeze. "They're just tired from the drive," I whispered, a lie we were all accustomed to. My sister Catherine arrived 20 minutes later with her husband James and their 3 children, 12-year-old twins Alexander and Victoria, and 14-year-old Elizabeth. The contrast was immediate and painful. My mother's face lit up as she embraced each of Catherine's children, cooing over Victoria's new haircut and asking Alexander detailed questions about his science competition. "And Elizabeth, look how tall you've grown," my mother exclaimed. "You look more like a proper young lady every time I see you." I busied myself in the kitchen, trying to ignore the familiar sting. Catherine followed me, looking immaculate as always in her designer dress and perfectly applied makeup. At 39, 2 years younger than me, she had somehow managed to become a successful corporate lawyer while maintaining a picture-perfect family, at least according to our mother's standards. "Need any help?" she asked, though we both knew she had no intention of actually helping. "I've got it under control," I replied, stirring the sauce with more force than necessary. "Mom seems in a good mood today," Catherine remarked, picking a cucumber slice from the salad. I gave a non-committal hum. My mother was always in a good mood around Catherine and her children. It was in my home, around my children, that her mood inevitably soured. Dinner started pleasantly enough. We passed dishes around, complimented the food. Except my mother, who suggested the sauce could use a little something, and made the usual small talk about work and school. Then Ethan, excitedly recounting his latest soccer game, accidentally knocked over his glass of water. It wasn't a catastrophe, just water easily cleaned up, but my mother's reaction would have been appropriate for a house fire. "Honestly, Olivia," she said sharply as I quickly mopped up the spill, "don't you teach your children to be more careful? Alexander and Victoria would never make such a mess." At the table, I felt Ethan shrink beside me. "It was an accident, Mom," I said, keeping my voice level. "No harm done. It's that kind of permissive attitude that—" she started, but I cut her off with a look. "Who wants pie?" I asked brightly, standing to clear the dinner plates. As I served dessert, the conversation shifted to the upcoming summer vacation. My parents owned a lakeside cabin that had been in our family for generations. Every summer, we would spend 2 weeks there, fishing, swimming, and making s'mores around the fire pit. It was tradition, sometimes the only time my children got to see their grandparents in a relaxed setting. "So about the cabin this year," my father began, looking unusually uncomfortable. "We've been thinking of doing things a bit differently." I paused, the pie server hovering mid-air. "Different how?" My mother straightened her napkin. "Well, the cabin isn't getting any bigger and all the children are growing up. It's getting rather crowded." "We've never minded the crowd," I said carefully. "The kids love sharing the bunk room." "Yes, well," my father continued, avoiding my eyes, "we thought this year might be better with fewer people." A cold sensation began spreading through my chest. "Fewer people?" My mother sighed impatiently. "What your father is trying to say, Olivia, is that we'd like Catherine's family to come for the full 2 weeks, and perhaps you and your children could come another time. Maybe a weekend in August." The room fell silent. Even Catherine looked surprised. "You want us to skip the family vacation?" I asked, not quite believing what I was hearing. "Not skip, dear. Just reschedule," my mother replied. "But why?" The question came from Sophie, her small voice confused. "We always go together." My mother looked at Sophie as if just remembering she was there. "Well, sweetheart, the truth is that Alexander and Victoria have their swim competition training, and Elizabeth has her music camp right after. This is the only time that works for them. And they're getting to an age where those activities are quite important for their futures." "My soccer camp is important too," Ethan said quietly. My mother waved her hand dismissively. "Yes, I'm sure it is. But this is different." "How is it different?" I asked, my voice hardening. My parents exchanged a glance. It was my father who spoke, his voice attempting gentleness but failing. "Livy, you know we love all our grandchildren. But Catherine's children are at crucial developmental stages. Alexander and Victoria are showing real promise in academics and athletics, and Elizabeth is already being scouted by music programs. They need this structured environment. And my children don't deserve the same consideration?" I could feel the heat rising to my face. My mother set down her fork with a sharp clink. "Your children are different, Olivia. They're more free-spirited. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "What's that supposed to mean?" I asked, though I already knew. Another loaded glance between my parents. Then my mother, with the brutal directness that had characterized my entire childhood, said, "They're undisciplined, Olivia. Too loud, too energetic, always breaking things or causing disruptions. Last summer, Sophie spilled juice all over the antique rug, and Ethan broke the model ship your grandfather built. They're children, Mom. Children have accidents. I could feel my control slipping. Catherine's children didn't have these accidents at their age," my father added, as if that settled the matter. The silence that followed was thick enough to cut. I looked at my children's faces. Ethan staring down at his lap, Sophie's eyes welling with tears. Then I looked at my sister, expecting at least a token defense of her niece and nephew. But Catherine was studiously examining her pie, not meeting my eyes. Something inside me snapped. 20 years of swallowed responses, of making excuses for my parents' behavior, of telling my children, Grandma and Grandpa love you in their own way. It all rose up like a tidal wave. "So let me make sure I understand," I said, my voice dangerously calm. "You're uninviting my children from the family vacation because you prefer Catherine's kids." "Now, Livy, that's not what my father began. "Yes, it is," my mother interrupted. "We might as well be honest. Catherine's children are simply easier to have around. They're well-behaved, they have proper manners, and they show real promise. Your children are, well, they're sweet in their way, but they require so much more management." The room froze. Even my mother seemed to realize she had crossed a line. Sophie let out a small sob, and Ethan's face had gone completely white. "Sophie, Ethan, please go to your rooms for a few minutes," I said quietly. "But Mom," Ethan started. "Now, please." Once they had left, I turned back to my parents. "How dare you?" I whispered. "How dare you say those things about my children in their own home, in front of them?" "Olivia, don't be dramatic," my mother said, though she at least had the decency to look slightly uncomfortable. "We're simply being practical." "Practical?" I repeated. "Is that what you call openly favoring one set of grandchildren over another?" "We don't favor," my father began, but I cut him off. "You do. You always have. But I never thought you'd be cruel enough to say it out loud, to make my children feel like they're not good enough." "They're just being honest, Liv," Catherine finally spoke up. "Maybe if you were stricter with Ethan and Sophie—" "Don't," I warned her. "Don't you dare try to make this about my parenting." I stood up, my chair scraping against the hardwood floor. "The family vacation isn't the issue here. This is about years, decades, of you treating me and my children like we're somehow less important, less valuable than Catherine and hers. And I'm done with it." "Olivia, you're overreacting," my mother said with a dismissive wave. "This is exactly the kind of emotional outburst we're talking about. You never could control your temper." "Get out," I said quietly. My mother blinked. "Excuse me?" "Get out of my house." My voice was steady now, my decision crystallizing with each word. "All of you. Now." "Olivia, be reasonable," my father started. "I've been reasonable for 41 years, Dad. I've made excuses for how you treat my children. I've pretended not to notice when you give Alexander and Victoria expensive gifts while Ethan and Sophie get clearance store toys. I've smiled and nodded when you praise Elizabeth's piano playing but never bother to attend Sophie's dance recitals. But I'm done now. I'm done pretending." My mother stood up, gathering her purse with practiced dignity. "If that's how you feel, then perhaps we should go. You clearly need some time to calm down and think about how you're behaving." "No, Mom," I said, meeting her eyes directly. "You need time to think about whether you want to be grandparents to all your grandchildren, or none of them." Because from now on, that's the only choice you have. My father looked stricken. Livy, don't say things you'll regret. The only thing I regret, I replied, is how long I've allowed you to make my children feel less than. The silence stretched between us like a chasm. Finally, my mother nodded stiffly. Come, Robert, Catherine, gather your children. We're leaving. As they collected their things, I remained standing by the table, my hands flat against the surface to hide their trembling. Part of me couldn't believe what I was doing. These were my parents, my family. Sunday dinners were our tradition. But another part, the mother in me that would protect my children at all costs, knew this was long overdue. At the door, my father paused. Livy, please. Goodbye, Dad, I said, not trusting myself to say more. After they left, I leaned against the closed door, listening to the deafening silence of my home. Then I heard a small sound from the staircase. Ethan and Sophie sat huddled on the steps, their faces tear-stained and confused. Did you mean it, Mom? Ethan asked, his voice small. Are we not going to see Grandma and Grandpa anymore? I went to them, gathering them both in my arms. I don't know, sweetheart. That depends on Grandma and Grandpa, and whether they can learn to treat everyone in this family with equal love and respect. Is something wrong with us? Sophie whispered against my shoulder. Why don't they like us as much? My heart broke at her words, but I pulled back to look them both in the eyes. Listen, to me, both of you. There is absolutely nothing wrong with you. Nothing. You are perfect exactly as you are. Energetic, creative, kind, wonderful children. The problem isn't with you. It never has been. Then why? Ethan began. Some people, I said carefully, even people in our family, have very specific ideas about how children should behave. They think being quiet and following all the rules is more important than being curious or creative or just being a kid. But they're wrong. I hugged them tighter, feeling their small bodies against mine. I will never let anyone make you feel like you're not enough, not even your grandparents. Do you understand? They nodded, though I knew they didn't fully comprehend what had happened tonight. How could they? I was 41 and still struggling to understand how my own parents could so callously dismiss their grandchildren. As I held my children, I knew the storm was just beginning. There would be angry phone calls, flying accusations, pressure from relatives to keep the peace. But something had shifted inside me tonight. A lifetime of seeking approval had given way to a fierce determination to protect what truly mattered. The family dinner tradition was over, but something new was taking its place, a commitment to breaking the cycle, to raising children who knew their worth didn't depend on meeting impossible standards. And as painful as tonight had been, I couldn't regret that. Little did I know that my parents' response would escalate this battle in ways I couldn't imagine, or that standing my ground would cost more than I ever expected to pay. The morning after, I had expelled my family from my home. I woke before dawn, my mind racing. The house felt eerily quiet without the usual Monday morning chaos. Mark still away on business, the children sleeping longer than usual after the emotional turbulence of the previous evening. I slipped out of bed and made my way to the kitchen, mechanically preparing coffee as memories from the disastrous dinner replayed in my mind. The casual cruelty of my mother's words. The way my father had looked anywhere but at me. Catherine's betrayal through silence. The devastation on my children's faces. I hadn't expected to sleep at all, but exhaustion had eventually pulled me under, only to release me into this strange liminal space between night and day, where everything felt simultaneously surreal and painfully clear. As the coffee maker gurgled, I stared out the window at the purple-gray sky and wondered if I had gone too far. 41 years of conditioning doesn't vanish overnight. The voice in my head that always urged reconciliation, that always found Excuses for my parents' behavior was already whispering, maybe you overreacted, maybe you misunderstood. My phone lit up on the counter. A text from Mark. Meetings running long. Miss you and the kids. Everything okay with dinner? I set the phone down without responding. How could I possibly compress last night's earthquake into a text message? The sound of small feet padding across the kitchen floor pulled me from my thoughts. Sophie appeared in her unicorn pajamas, her curls wild from sleep, eyes still puffy from crying. "Morning, sweetheart," I said, forcing brightness into my voice. "Pancakes?" She climbed onto a stool at the kitchen island, unusually subdued. "Mom, are Grandma and Grandpa mad at us forever now?" The question hit me like a physical blow. I abandoned the coffee and came around to sit beside her. "No, baby, they're not mad at you. This isn't about you at all. But they don't want us at the cabin," she said, picking at a loose thread on her sleeve. "Victoria said it's because we're too noisy and we break stuff." I felt a surge of anger at my niece for repeating such hurtful words, but I kept my voice steady. Everyone makes noise sometimes. Everyone accidentally breaks things. That's part of being human. "Not Victoria," Sophie said miserably. "She never gets in trouble." I took her small hands in mine. "Sophie, look at me. Victoria isn't perfect. No one is. And even if she were, that wouldn't make you any less wonderful exactly as you are." She seemed unconvinced, but before I could say more, Ethan appeared in the doorway, looking older than his 11 years. "Is Dad coming home today?" he asked, ignoring my offer of breakfast. "Tomorrow," I replied. "He's trying to wrap things up early." Ethan nodded, his face unreadable. "Are you going to tell him what happened?" "Of course I am," I said, surprised by the question. "He'll be mad," Ethan said flatly. "He always says we need to try harder with Grandma and Grandpa." The observation stung because it was true. Mark, having grown up in a warm, demonstrative family, had never fully understood the complexities of my relationship with my parents. His standard advice was, just talk to them, or give them another chance. Well-intentioned but painfully simplistic. This is different, I assured him, though I wasn't entirely certain. Would Mark support my stand? Or would he, like everyone else in my life, urge me to smooth things over for the sake of family harmony? I managed to get the children fed and off to school, promising we would talk more that evening. As I cleaned up the breakfast dishes, my phone rang. Catherine. I let it go to voicemail. It rang again immediately, and again. On the fourth call, I finally answered, bracing myself. "What do you want, Catherine?" "What the hell was that last night?" she demanded, skipping any greeting. "Mom's beside herself. Dad hasn't said a word since you kicked them out, and now I'm stuck dealing with the fallout. As usual." I gripped the phone tighter. "As usual?" "That's rich, Catherine. I've been managing our parents' disappointment my entire life, while you coasted on their adoration." "Oh, please," she scoffed. "You're not seriously playing the victim here. You completely overreacted to a simple logistical suggestion about the cabin." "It wasn't about the cabin," I said, struggling to keep my voice even. "It was about them openly admitting they prefer your children over mine." "They didn't say that," Catherine protested, though her voice lacked conviction. "Mom literally said my children are undisciplined and disruptive, while yours show real promise." "What would you call that?" A pause. "They're from a different generation. Live. They have certain expectations about how children should behave. And that excuses them making my children feel worthless?" Another pause. Longer this time. When Catherine spoke again, her voice had softened slightly. "Look, no one's saying, your kids are worthless, they're great kids, they're just different from mine. More spirited." "More spirited," I repeated. "That's the euphemism we're going with?" "Olivia, please. They're still our parents. They're not perfect, but they're family. Being family doesn't give them the right to hurt my children, Catherine. Not anymore," She sighed. That familiar sound of exasperation I'd heard throughout our childhood whenever I failed to fall in line. So what now? You're just cutting them off? Over one comment? It wasn't one comment. It was the final comment in a lifetime of comments, looks, and actions that made it crystal clear where my children and I stand in the hierarchy of this family. You're being melodramatic, Catherine said dismissively. Mom says you should take some time to cool off, and then we can all pretend this never happened. I bet she does, I said bitterly. That's always been the family way, hasn't it? Sweep it under the rug, pretend everything's fine, and wait for me to cave. It's called being mature, Olivia. I almost laughed. No, Catherine. It's called enabling. Toxic behavior. And I'm done with it. Tell Mom and Dad they're welcome to apologize to my children. Sincerely apologize, whenever they're ready. Until then, we're taking a break from family gatherings. You can't be serious, she said, voice rising. What about Dad's birthday next month? The 4th of July picnic? Thanksgiving? We'll make other plans. The kids will be devastated if their cousins aren't there. This time I did laugh, a short, harsh sound. Funny how you're suddenly concerned about the children's feelings. Were you concerned last night when your daughters were hearing their grandparents call their cousins undisciplined and disruptive? That's different? It's not different, Catherine. It's just not happening to your children, so you don't care. I could almost hear her recoiling from the accusation. When she spoke again, her voice was ice cold. You know what? Fine. Have it your way. But don't come crying to me when you realize what a mistake you're making. She hung up before I could respond. I set the phone down with trembling hands, adrenaline coursing through me. Never in my life had I spoken to my sister. That way, directly, without apology, without immediately backtracking to keep the peace. It felt both terrifying and exhilarating. I spent the rest of the morning in a daze, going through the motions of my freelance graphic design work without really seeing the screen. By noon, my inbox contained 4 emails from my mother, subject, lines ranging from your behavior to we need to talk, 2 missed calls from my father, and a group text from my aunt asking what was going on with the family. Ignored them all and drove to the elementary school to have lunch with the children, something I rarely did but suddenly felt desperately important. Seeing their faces light up when I appeared in the cafeteria made something resolve within me. This was worth any family fallout. That afternoon, as I waited in the carpool line to pick them up, I received a text from my father. Your mother and I are coming over tonight to sort this out. We'll be there at 7. Not a request, but an announcement. So typical of how they operated, assuming I would rearrange my life to accommodate them. I texted back, No, I meant what I said. We need space right now. His response was immediate. This isn't optional, Olivia. I stared at those words for a long moment, feeling a lifetime of patterns trying to reassert themselves. The good daughter would acquiesce. The peacekeeper would open the door and listen to their explanations, their justifications, their subtle shifting of blame. The child still desperate for approval would apologize for overreacting. But I wasn't just their daughter anymore. I was a mother whose children had been hurt. That changed everything. I typed my response with steady fingers. Yes, it is optional. If you come to my house tonight, I won't answer the door. I turned off my phone, not willing to see his response or give him the opportunity to wear me down. That evening, I told the children what was happening, not everything, but enough for them to understand we were taking a break from seeing their grandparents and aunt for a while. I expected questions, protests even, but they just nodded with a resigned understanding that broke my heart. They had absorbed more of the family dynamics than I had realized. Mark called around 8, and I finally told him everything. There was a long silence when I finished. Olivia, he said finally, his voice gentle but concerned. I understand why you're upset. What your mother said was way out of line. But cutting them off completely? Is that really the answer? I had expected this response, but it still hurt. What would you have me do, Mark? Pretend it didn't happen? Let them keep treating our children like they're second rate? Of course not. But there's a middle ground between letting them get away with it and total estrangement. They're your parents. They love you in their way. Their way isn't good enough anymore, I said firmly. Not for me, and definitely not for Ethan. And Sophie. He sighed, and I could picture him running a hand through his hair the way he did when stressed. I just hate to see you throw away your relationship with your parents. Once that door closes— They closed it, I interrupted. I'm just refusing to pretend it's still open. We talked in circles for another 20 minutes before agreeing to discuss it more when he got home. I knew he meant well, but a lifetime of healthy family relationships had left him unable to fully comprehend what I was dealing with. To him, all family conflicts were ultimately resolvable with enough goodwill and communication. He couldn't understand that some wounds run too deep for Band-Aid solutions. At precisely 7:00 p.m., headlights swept across the living room wall as a car pulled into our driveway. My stomach clenched. I peered through the curtains to see my parents' Lexus idling there, my father's silhouette rigid behind the wheel, my mother's head turning toward our front door. I stepped back from the window, heart hammering. The doorbell rang, then again, more insistently. I stood perfectly still in the middle of the living room, not even breathing. After a minute, knocking replaced the doorbell, first polite, then increasingly forceful. "Olivia, we know you're in there," my mother's voice called, loud enough to carry through the door. "Stop being childish and open up." The children were upstairs, but I still worried they might hear. I crept closer to the door, not to open it, but to speak through it. "I told Dad not to come," I said, keeping my voice low but firm. I meant it. "Please leave. We are not having this conversation through a door," my mother replied indignantly. "Let us in immediately." "There's no conversation to have right now," I said. "I need time and space, and I expect you to respect that." My father's voice now. "Livy, please. This isn't like you. Just open the door so we can talk this through like adults." The familiar guilt tugged at me, but I held firm. "Not tonight. Maybe in a few weeks, but not now. Please go home." "If you don't open this door," my mother said, her voice taking on the dangerous edge I remembered from childhood confrontations, "you're going to regret it." Is this really the example you want to set for your children? Shutting out family? Holding grudges? The manipulation was so transparent it almost made me laugh. The example I'm setting is that it's okay to have boundaries, even with family. Especially with family. I could hear them conferring in hushed, angry whispers. Then my father again. "Olivia, your mother isn't well. Her blood pressure—" "Don't," I cut him off. "Don't use health concerns to manipulate me. That's low, even for you two." More angry whispering. Then, to my surprise, I heard them retreating, footsteps moving away from the door. I risked another peek through the curtains and saw them getting back into their car. For a moment, I felt a rush of relief. They were actually leaving. Then my mother stepped back out, marched to the front door, and slipped something under it before returning to the car. I waited until they had backed out of the driveway before retrieving the envelope. Inside was a check for $5,000, with a Post-it note attached. "For the children's summer activities, since you won't be at the cabin. We're still their grandparents." The check felt like a burning coal in my hand. This was so typical, trying to buy their way back into our lives, to create financial dependency, to assert their role as providers without addressing the actual problem. In the past, I might have weakened, might have seen it as a peace offering, or convinced myself it was just their way of showing love. Not anymore. I tore the check into small pieces and flushed them down the toilet. When I returned to the living room, Sophie was sitting on the bottom stair, her stuffed rabbit clutched tight against her chest. "Were Grandma and Grandpa here?" she asked in a small voice. I sat beside her on the stair. "Yes, but they've gone, now." "Why didn't you let them in?" "Don't you always say we should talk about problems?" I put my arm around her. "Sometimes talking helps, but only when everyone is really listening. Sometimes we need a little time apart first." She nodded, though I could tell she didn't fully understand. "Elizabeth texted me," she said after a moment. "She said we're not cousins anymore." My chest tightened painfully. "That's not true, sweetheart. You'll always be cousins, no matter what." Then why did she say it? I chose my words carefully. Sometimes, when grown-ups disagree, it affects how children talk to each other. But that doesn't make it true or right. She leaned against me, suddenly seeming much younger than 8. "I don't want to not be cousins." "I know, baby." I kissed the top of her head. "This is all very complicated right now. But I promise you, we're going to figure it out." After I tucked her back into bed, I sat alone in the kitchen, staring at my silent phone. Part of me wanted to call my sister, to beg her to keep the children out of this adult conflict. But I knew Catherine too well. She would use any outreach as ammunition, as proof that I was already regretting my stance. Instead, I opened my laptop and began typing an email I never thought I'd write. A detailed account of the previous night's events, the years of favoritism leading up to it, and my decision to create distance from my parents. I addressed it to my extended family, aunts, uncles, cousins, knowing my mother would already be working the phone lines, spinning her version of events. I had never publicly challenged the family narrative before. There was an unspoken rule that disagreements stayed private, that we presented a united front to the world. Breaking that rule felt both terrifying and necessary. As I typed the final paragraph, a strange calm settled over me. I don't expect everyone to understand or support my decision, but I will no longer participate in a family dynamic that hurts my children. Sometimes love means setting boundaries, even when it's painful. Even when it means walking away. I hit send before I could lose my nerve, then closed the laptop and sat in the darkness of my kitchen, feeling like I had just stepped off a cliff, not knowing where or how I would land. Little did I know, my email would trigger a family earthquake, with aftershocks that would reach further than I ever imagined, and that my parents were already formulating a response that would force me to decide just how far I was willing to go to protect my children. Mark returned home the next evening, his face lined with exhaustion from the business trip and concern about our family situation. I had expected an argument, more pressure to reconcile with my parents, but instead, he listened as I recounted the doorstep confrontation and the torn-up check. When I finished, he pulled me into a tight embrace. "I'm sorry I wasn't here," he said against my hair. "I should have been here for you and the kids." The simple acknowledgement brought tears to my eyes. "You think I did the right thing?" He pulled back to look at me. "Honestly, I think you did the only thing you could do. I've always tried to see the best in your parents, but what your mother said about our children..." He shook his head, jaw tightening. "That crosses a line." His support washed over me like a wave, washing away the doubt that had clung to me since Sunday night. For years, Mark had been the peacekeeper, the one urging compromise and understanding. His unwavering support now felt like permission to trust my own instincts. The following morning, my inbox contained 17 new emails, responses from the extended family to my message. I braced myself before opening the first one from my mother's sister, Aunt Patricia. To my surprise, it wasn't a condemnation, but a thoughtful acknowledgement of patterns she'd observed over the years. While I can't pretend to know all the details, she wrote, "I've seen how Eleanor treats you and your children differently. It was the same with you and Catherine growing up. I said nothing then, and I've regretted it. You're breaking a cycle, Olivia. That takes courage." Not all the responses were supportive. Uncle George, my father's brother, wrote a scathing reply calling me selfish and dramatic. My cousin Jennifer suggested I was overreacting to typical grandparent favoritism. But there were enough messages of understanding, even from people I'd assumed would automatically side with my parents, to make me feel less alone. The most surprising response came from my elderly cousin Meredith, a distant relative in her 80s who rarely involved herself in family matters. Your grandmother Rebecca faced this exact situation with her own mother-in-law, who blatantly favored one grandchild over the others. Rebecca did what was expected in those days. She endured it silently while watching her children internalize the message that they weren't good enough. On her deathbed, she told me it was her greatest regret. "Stand your ground, Olivia. This pattern is older than you know." I printed her message and pinned it to my bulletin board, a reminder that I wasn't just fighting a personal battle, but pushing back against generations of harmful family dynamics. 3 days passed with no direct contact from my parents or Catherine. I knew it was the calm before the storm, but I used the time to focus on Ethan and Sophie. We planted flowers in the garden, had a movie night with their favorite pizza, and I took a day off work to volunteer at their school field day, something I normally would have been too busy to do with my packed schedule of family obligations. The children seemed lighter somehow, as if the absence of their grandparents' critical gaze allowed them to relax in ways I hadn't fully realized they couldn't before. Sophie chattered more freely at dinner. Ethan invited a friend over without first anxiously cleaning his room to grandparent standards, small changes that spoke volumes. Then came Saturday, exactly 1 week after the disastrous dinner. I was helping Sophie with her science project in the kitchen when the doorbell rang. Through the peephole, I saw not my parents, but Catherine, standing alone on the porch with an uncharacteristically uncertain expression. I hesitated, then opened the door halfway. "Catherine, can I come in?" she asked, none of the anger from our phone call evident in her voice. "Just to talk. No ambush, I promise." I studied her for a moment, then stepped back to let her in. Sophie looked up from the kitchen table, her face lighting up briefly before dimming as she remembered the new family dynamics. "Hi, Aunt Catherine," she said cautiously. Catherine attempted a smile. "Hey, Soph. Cool project." "We're making a model of the water cycle," Sophie explained, her natural enthusiasm winning out over wariness. "Want to see?" "Maybe in a bit, honey," I interjected. "Aunt Catherine and I need to talk first. Why don't you take your project up to your room for now?" Once Sophie had gathered her materials and disappeared upstairs, I turned to my sister. "What do you want, Catherine?" She took a seat at the kitchen island, running her finger along the granite countertop. "Things have gotten out of hand. Have they?" I poured myself a cup of coffee, but didn't offer her one. From where I stand, they're finally exactly where they should be. Mom and Dad are devastated, Liv. Dad's barely eating. Mom keeps bursting into tears. "Is that really what you wanted?" I leaned against the counter. What I wanted was for my children to be treated with the same love and respect as yours. What I wanted was for my parents to acknowledge their behavior and apologize. Have they expressed any interest in doing that? Catherine shifted uncomfortably. "They feel attacked. That email you sent to the entire family was the truth." "It was your version of the truth," she countered. "And now you've got the whole extended family taking sides, congratulating you for standing up to the big bad wolves while Mom and Dad are being vilified. If telling the objective truth about what happened makes them look bad, that's not my problem," Catherine sighed, her composure slipping. "Look, I didn't come here to fight. I came because—" She hesitated, then reached into her purse and withdrew an envelope. "Because of this." I took the envelope warily, half expecting another check. Inside, however, was a legal document. As I scanned it, confusion gave way to disbelief, then burning anger. A petition for grandparent visitation rights? I looked up at her, stunned. They're suing for the legal right to see my children? Catherine at least had the decency to look uncomfortable. They're just exploring their options, Liv. They feel like you've given them no choice. No choice? I slapped the document down on the counter. They had plenty of choices. They could have apologized. They could have reflected on their behavior. They could have respected the boundaries I set. Instead, they're taking me to court? They're afraid they'll never see Ethan and Sophie again. And whose fault is that? I demanded. All they had to do was treat my children with basic kindness and respect. That's literally the bare minimum. Catherine stood, raising her hands in a placating gesture. I told them this was a bad idea, but they wouldn't listen. Mom went to see their lawyer the day after you sent that email. The timing made a cold fury wash over me. So this isn't about missing their grandchildren. It's about punishing me for speaking up publicly. It's complicated. It's really not. I cut her off. It's about control. They lost control over me. So now they're trying to use the legal system to get it back. Catherine's expression shifted, a hint of her own frustration breaking through. You know what? Maybe it is about control. But you started this war, Olivia. You drew the battle lines when you banned them from seeing the kids. I didn't ban them from seeing the kids. I said they needed to apologize before seeing them again. That's not a ban. It's a completely reasonable condition. Well, they see it differently. I studied my sister, suddenly seeing her involvement in a new light. Why are you really here, Catherine? To deliver their legal threat or to try to convince me to back down before this goes any further? She didn't answer immediately, which was answer enough. They sent you to do their dirty work, I realized. To soften me up, get me to drop my boundaries before the legal proceedings start. You're still their good daughter, doing exactly what they want. A flash of hurt crossed her face, quickly masked by indignation. That's not fair, isn't it? When have you ever stood up to them, Catherine? When have you ever done anything that might jeopardize your position as the favorite? You have no idea what my relationship with them is like, she said quietly. I know exactly what it's like. You do what they want. They shower you with approval. I've watched it my whole life. Catherine grabbed her purse, clearly ready to leave. I tried to help, Olivia. Remember that when this gets ugly. It's already ugly, I replied. And for the record, you didn't come here to help me. You came to help them. After she left, I sat at the kitchen table with the legal document, my hands trembling with anger and a growing sense of dread. I knew enough about family law to know that grandparent visitation cases were complicated. While parents' rights were generally prioritized, courts did sometimes grant visitation rights to grandparents, especially if they could demonstrate an established relationship with the children. The petition detailed all the ways my parents had been involved in Ethan and Sophie's lives, birthday parties they'd attended, Christmas gifts they'd given, the occasional school pickup when I'd been desperate for help. It was all framed to make them sound like devoted grandparents whose access to their beloved grandchildren had been arbitrarily and cruelly cut off. There was no mention of the favoritism, the criticism, the subtle undermining of my parenting, or the damage their behavior had inflicted on Ethan and Sophie's self-esteem. No mention of the condition I'd set for resuming contact, a simple, sincere apology. I called Mark at work, something I rarely did. They're suing us, I said when he answered, my voice shaking. For grandparent visitation rights. His response was immediate and firm. We'll fight it, all the way, whatever it takes. That evening, we sat down with the children to explain the situation in the gentlest terms possible. We didn't mention the lawsuit, just that Grandma and Grandpa were very upset about not seeing them and that things might be tense for a while. But we didn't do anything wrong, Ethan said, his young face clouded with worry. No, you didn't, Mark assured him, ruffling his hair. This is grown-up stuff, bud. Nothing for you to worry about. But I could see in my son's eyes that he didn't believe it. At 11, he was old enough to sense the gravity of the situation, to understand that something fundamental had shifted in our family. After the children were in bed, Mark and I researched lawyers who specialized in family law. The costs would be substantial. Money we had earmarked for a kitchen renovation, possibly even dipping into the children's college funds. But what choice did we have? We could try to settle, Mark suggested as we compared attorney profiles. Find some middle ground that doesn't involve courts and legal fees. I shook my head. That's what they want, for the threat of a lawsuit to scare us back into line. If we give in now, nothing will change. They'll know they can always use legal pressure to get their way. He nodded, squeezing my hand. Then we fight. The following day, I received a text from a number I didn't recognize. "This is James. We need to talk." My brother-in-law had never contacted me directly before. He usually left all family communication to Catherine. I called him back, curious and wary. "Catherine doesn't know I'm calling," he said without preamble. "But this has gone too far, and someone needs to be the voice of reason." "I'm listening," I said cautiously. James sighed heavily. "Your parents' lawsuit isn't just about seeing Ethan and Sophie. There's more to it." "What do you mean?" "They've been helping you financially for years, Olivia. The down payment on your house, Ethan's private school tuition for those 2 years, the loan for Mark's business. They're claiming it was all conditional, on them having a relationship with the kids." I felt the blood drain from my face. That's absurd. Those were gifts. Dad specifically said the house money was my early inheritance. Maybe that's what he said, but they're prepared to argue otherwise. They have documentation, notes about repayment terms, emails where you thanked them and promised they'd always be part of the children's lives. My mind raced back through years of correspondence. Had I ever phrased my gratitude that way? Possibly. Probably. It would have been natural to assure them they'd always be close to the children when accepting financial help. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked, my suspicion mounting. "Aren't you on their side?" There was a pause before he answered. "I care about my children, Olivia, and what your parents are doing, the way they compare the cousins, the way they pit all of you against each other. It isn't healthy for anyone, not for your kids, and not for mine either." This admission stunned me. "Catherine seems fine with it." "Catherine is terrified of losing her position," he said bluntly. "She spent her whole life trying to be what they wanted. She doesn't know how to be anything else." I absorbed this, seeing my sister in a slightly different light. "So what are you suggesting? Talk to your own lawyer, then try for mediation before this gets uglier. Your parents will fight dirty. They've already discussed trying for temporary guardianship based on claims that your home environment is unstable." "What?" I nearly shouted. "That's insane. We're stable, loving parents." "I know that," James said quietly. "But they're desperate and angry. Mostly, they're used to getting their way. When Eleanor Bishop decides she wants something, she usually gets it." After we hung up, I sat in stunned silence, trying to process this escalation. It was no longer just about mandated visits. They were threatening to argue that Mark and I were unfit parents. The thought made me physically ill. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about everything James had said, about the years of financial help we'd accepted from my parents. At the time, it had seemed like genuine generosity, like they were finally showing love in a way they knew how. Now those gifts felt like chains they'd been quietly wrapping around us, link by link. Around 3 a.m., I slipped out of bed and went to my home office. I began pulling financial records, emails, birthday cards, anything that might document the true nature of their financial support. What I found made my stomach knot with dread. The checks for Ethan's school tuition had memo lines reading, "Ethan Education Investment." The wire transfer for our house down payment came with a formal letter stating it was an advance on Olivia's inheritance. But there were also emails where I'd promised they'd always be a central part of the children's lives in gratitude for their help, messages that could be twisted to imply conditional gifts. Most damning was a birthday card from 3 years ago where my father had written, "We're so happy to help with Ethan's education. It's an investment in our legacy and our continued relationship with our grandchildren." At the time, it had seemed like a slightly formal but well-meaning sentiment. Now it read like a contractual clause. As dawn broke, I had compiled enough evidence to start building our defense, but also enough to understand that this fight would be far more complicated than I'd initially thought. My parents weren't just attempting to force visitation, they were prepared to claim that years of financial support entitled them to a say in my children's lives. I was still at my desk when Mark found me in the morning, papers spread across every surface. "You need to see this," I said, handing him the most concerning documents. He scanned them, his face darkening. "They were planning this all along," he said finally. "Every gift, every check, it was insurance. Their way of making sure you could never truly break free. We could pay them back," I suggested desperately. "Every penny they've ever given us. We could take out a second mortgage, liquidate our retirement funds." "Liv," Mark interrupted gently. "This isn't really about money. The money is just their leverage. This is about control. It always has been." He was right, of course. Even if we could somehow repay every dollar, my parents would find another angle, another pressure point. They weren't going to stop until they got what they wanted. Either my complete surrender or their day in court where they could publicly paint me as an ungrateful daughter, keeping loving grandparents from their grandchildren. My phone chimed, with a text from my father. "We've given you time to reconsider. Our lawyer will be in touch on Monday unless you're ready to be reasonable." The old me would have crumbled under this pressure. The dutiful daughter, the peacemaker, the one who always gave in for the sake of family harmony would have apologized, backtracked, found some way to smooth things over. But staring at the evidence of their long-term manipulation, something hardened inside me. They had used money to create obligation. They had weaponized their status as grandparents. They were willing to drag us through an ugly legal battle rather than simply apologize for hurting my children. I didn't respond to my father's text. Instead, I called the most aggressive family law attorney on our list and scheduled an appointment for that afternoon. Then I woke the children, made them pancakes shaped like stars, and told them I loved them exactly as they were. As I watched them eat, laughing over maple syrup and orange juice, I made a silent promise. This would be the generation where the cycle of conditional love and emotional manipulation ended. Whatever it cost, whatever we had to endure, my children would grow up knowing they were enough, exactly as they were. "Mom, are you okay?" Ethan asked, noticing my intense gaze. I smiled, pushing aside my worries for the moment. "I'm perfect, honey. Just thinking about how lucky I am to be your mom." Later, as we prepared to meet with the lawyer, I received an unexpected text from Aunt Patricia. "Eleanor and Robert are calling everyone, making their case. They've got the family choosing sides. Some are with you, some with them. This will get worse before it gets better. But remember, they only fight this hard when they're afraid they're losing. Stand firm, Olivia. The power is shifting." The power is shifting. Those words resonated as Mark and I drove to the attorney's office. For the first time in my life, I wasn't playing by my parents' rules. I was setting my own. And while their response was more severe than I could have imagined, it confirmed what I had always suspected but never fully acknowledged. Their love, their support, their very presence in our lives had always been conditional. Now the conditions were clear, the battle lines drawn. They had financial resources and a lifetime of manipulating the family narrative on their side. I had the truth and the fierce determination to protect my children from repeating my own childhood experiences. As we parked outside the law office, Mark squeezed my hand. "Whatever happens, we're in this together. You're doing the right thing, I nodded, drawing strength from his certainty. I know. For the first time, I really know. Little did I realize that our legal consultation would reveal options my parents never anticipated, and that the real power shift was yet to come. The fight for my children's emotional well-being was just beginning, and I was finally ready for war. Mrs. Carlyle, I'm going to be direct with you, Diane Levine, our newly hired attorney, stated as she reviewed the documents spread across her desk. Your parents have built a case that, while manipulative, could potentially hold up in court. Mark and I exchanged worried glances. The law office, with its dark wood paneling and leather chairs, felt both intimidating and reassuring. A serious place for the serious battle ahead. So you're saying we could lose? I asked, my throat tight. Diane leaned forward, her expression thoughtful. In grandparent visitation cases, courts typically consider whether an ongoing relationship is in the children's best interest. Given their history of involvement, the financial support, and the relatively recent nature of the estrangement, a judge might rule for some limited visitation rights. My heart sank. The thought of being legally forced to expose my children to my parents' toxic behavior made me physically ill. However, Diane continued, her tone shifting, their overreach gives us an opportunity. This petition contains claims about financial agreements that go far beyond typical grandparent rights. They're essentially arguing that financial gifts created a contractual right to access your children. That's a dangerous precedent no family court judge would want to set. She sorted through the papers, pulling out several key documents, and these emails where they discuss investment in your children's futures, especially in the context of their later threats. It suggests a pattern of using money as leverage that borders on financial coercion. Mark leaned forward. So, what's our counter-strategy? Diane's smile was razor-sharp. We go on the offensive. We file a countersuit claiming intentional infliction of emotional distress through financial manipulation and parental alienation. We argue that they're using this lawsuit not out of genuine concern for the children, but as punishment for your attempt to set reasonable boundaries. Can we really do that? I asked, stunned by the suggestion of turning the tables so completely. Not only can we, but we should, Diane stated firmly. Listen, your parents are counting on your continued pattern of eventually backing down. They've structured their entire case around the assumption that you'll be too afraid of conflict, too concerned about family harmony, to truly fight back. She was right. Even now, a part of me wanted to call my parents and find some compromise, some way to avoid the ugliness of a court battle. Diane seemed to read my thoughts. Olivia, I've handled dozens of cases like this. The only way to break this cycle is to show them once and for all that their usual tactics won't work anymore, that the cost of trying to control you through legal means will be higher than they're willing to pay. As we left the attorney's office with a detailed action plan, I felt both terrified and strangely liberated. For the first time, I wasn't just reacting to my parents' manipulations, I was actively countering them. The next morning, reality crashed in when I checked my email and found a message from the elementary school principal requesting a meeting regarding some concerns that have been brought to our attention. A cold dread settled in my stomach as I called the school. Ms. Bentley, what's this about? I asked when the principal came on the line. There was an uncomfortable pause. Mrs. Carlyle, I received a call yesterday from your mother expressing concerns about Ethan and Sophie's home environment. She mentioned potential instability that might be affecting their academic performance. I gripped the phone so tightly my knuckles turned white. My mother has no right to contact you about my children. Normally I would agree, the principal said carefully. But she mentioned she's pursuing grandparent rights and suggested there might be welfare concerns we should be aware of. As you know, we're mandated reporters. This is harassment, I interrupted, struggling to keep my voice steady. My parents are retaliating because I limited contact after they made hurtful comments to my children. There are absolutely no welfare concerns in our home. I understand, but I still need to document that I've followed up. Could you come in this afternoon? Just a brief meeting to clear this up. I agreed, then immediately called Diane. Her response was swift and unequivocal. This is textbook intimidation. They're creating a paper trail to support their case. Bring your husband to the meeting if possible. Stay calm and document everything. We'll add this to our countersuit. By the time I arrived at the school with Mark, I had moved beyond shock to cold fury. The principal seemed relieved to see both of us, and the meeting was mercifully brief. She acknowledged that the children showed no signs of distress or academic issues, and agreed that my mother's call appeared to be part of a family dispute rather than a genuine concern. For what it's worth, she added as we were leaving, Sophie's teacher mentioned that she seems happier these past couple of weeks, more confident in class. The observation hit me like a physical blow. More confident without her grandparents' critical presence? What did that say about their influence on my child? As we walked to the car, Mark's phone rang. The tense expression that crossed his face as he answered told me this wasn't good news. That was my boss, he said after hanging up. Your father called the company expressing concerns about my work-life balance given our family crisis. Suggested they might want to keep an eye on my performance. I stared at him in disbelief. He's trying to threaten your job? Trying and failing, Mark assured me. My boss thought it was bizarre and inappropriate, but he wanted to give me a heads up. We sat in the car, both processing this new level of attack. They were systematically targeting every aspect of our lives. The children's school, Mark's employment, our finances, our reputation in the community. It was a scorched earth campaign designed to make us surrender. They've never had to deal with real consequences before, I realized aloud. Every time they've behaved badly in the past, everyone accommodated them, made excuses, kept the peace. They genuinely don't know how to handle someone standing up to them. Mark squeezed my hand. Well, they're about to learn. The next morning, Diane filed our countersuit. By afternoon, my father was calling nonstop. I let each call go to voicemail, following our attorney's advice to avoid direct communication. After the sixth call, he left a message, his voice shaking with barely controlled rage. Olivia, what the hell do you think you're doing? This ridiculous countersuit is going to destroy this family. Is that what you want? To tear apart everything we've built? Your mother is beside herself. If you had any idea what this is doing to her health, you need to call off your attack dog of a lawyer and start behaving like a member of this family again. I played the message for Diane, who simply nodded. Classic Darvo, deny, attack, reverse victim, and offender. They initiated legal action. But now you're the aggressor for defending yourself. It's actually good evidence for our case. 3 days later, my parents escalated further. A formal letter arrived from Child Protective Services stating they had received a report and were obligated to investigate. The caseworker who visited our home was professional and apologetic, clearly recognizing the situation for what it was. A malicious report likely filed to create leverage. She completed her assessment quickly, finding no concerns whatsoever, and assured us the case would be closed immediately. But the damage was done. The mere fact of the investigation, the stranger, walking through our home, inspecting our refrigerator, asking the children questions about how we treated them, left all of us shaken. That night, Ethan had a nightmare for the first time in years, and Sophie became clingy, afraid I would somehow disappear. They crossed a line, Mark said as we sat at the kitchen table after finally getting the children back to sleep. His voice was different than I'd ever heard it. Hard, resolute. Using CPS as a weapon? That's unforgivable. I nodded, a cold certainty settling over me. This isn't about grandparent rights anymore. This is about punishment. They're willing to traumatize their own grandchildren to get back at me for defying them. The next morning, I emailed Diane with a new instruction. No more holding back. Use everything we have. Within hours, our revised countersuit was filed, now including claims of harassment, filing false reports to government agencies, and intentional infliction of emotional distress on minor children. Diane also petitioned for an emergency hearing on a temporary restraining order that would bar my parents from contacting the children's school, Mark's employer, or any government agency regarding our family without court approval. The judge granted the emergency hearing for the following day. Facing my parents across a courtroom was surreal. My mother perfectly composed in an expensive suit, my father looking distinguished and somber. They barely glanced at me, as if I were a stranger rather than their daughter. Their attorney argued passionately against the restraining order, painting a picture of devoted grandparents desperately concerned about their grandchildren's welfare, forced to seek help from appropriate authorities out of pure love and worry. Then Diane presented our evidence. The timeline of events showing the CPS report came immediately after our countersuit. The recorded voicemails with thinly veiled threats, the call to Mark's employer, the documentation of the pattern of favoritism and emotional manipulation that had led to the original estrangement. The judge, a stern woman in her 60s, listened carefully to both sides. When the arguments concluded, she removed her glasses and addressed my parents directly. Mr. and Mrs. Bishop, while I understand your desire to maintain a relationship with your grandchildren, your actions suggest this lawsuit is being used as a tool of retaliation rather than out of genuine concern for the children's welfare. Filing reports with CPS and contacting the father's employer after legal proceedings were initiated appears punitive and designed to create leverage. She replaced her glasses, reviewing her notes. I'm granting the temporary restraining order, prohibiting contact with the children's school, Mr. Carlisle's employer, or any government agency regarding this family. Furthermore, I'm ordering all parties to attend mediation before this case proceeds further. This family needs to step back from the brink before irreparable damage is done. As we left the courtroom, I caught my mother's eye for the first time. The look she gave me wasn't anger or hurt. It was pure, cold hatred, as if I were an enemy rather than her child. In that moment, I finally understood that this had never really been about love for my children. It had been about ownership and control, about maintaining the family hierarchy with themselves at the top, their authority unquestioned. The court-ordered mediation was scheduled for the following week. The days leading up to it were eerily quiet. No calls, no emails, no further attacks. I should have felt relieved, but instead, I sensed they were regrouping, planning their next move. The night before mediation, I received an unexpected visitor. Catherine, looking uncharacteristically disheveled, appeared on my doorstep after the children were in bed. "Can I come in?" she asked, her voice hoarse as if she'd been crying. I hesitated, then stepped back to allow her inside. We sat at the kitchen table, an uncomfortable silence stretching between us. "I didn't know about the CPS report," she finally said. "Or the call to Mark's work. I would never have approved that." "But you knew about the lawsuit," I pointed out. She nodded miserably. "They said they just wanted visitation rights. I didn't realize they would go this far." "Didn't you?" I searched her face. "You've spent your whole life watching them bulldoze over anyone who defies them. What did you think would happen when I refused to back down?" Catherine stared down at her hands. "They've never been like this with me. I knew they could be difficult, controlling. But this level of vindictiveness..." She trailed off, then met my eyes. James was right. This isn't healthy for anyone, including my kids. Victoria came home crying yesterday because Grandma told her she needed to be the example since her cousins were being raised without proper guidance. She's 12, Liv. She shouldn't be bearing that kind of weight. Hearing this unexpected vulnerability from my normally poised sister disarmed me slightly. "So what are you saying?" "I'm saying I can't keep pretending everything is normal." Not after what they've done. She took a deep breath. I'll be at the mediation tomorrow, not as their ally, but as a neutral party concerned about all the children involved. I eyed her skeptically. You're going against them? You've never stood up to them before. A flash of hurt crossed her face, but she didn't deny it. Maybe it's time I started. After she left, I called Mark, who was working late preparing for an important presentation. Catherine just came by. She claims she's switching sides, or at least not actively supporting them anymore. Do you believe her? He asked. I don't know, I admitted. It could be genuine concern, or it could be another tactic. They've already shown they're willing to try anything. Trust your instincts, he advised. You know her better than anyone. The mediation center was housed in a modern office building, all glass and neutral tones designed to create a sense of calm. My parents arrived with their attorney, both impeccably dressed and expressionless. Catherine arrived separately, nodding tentatively to me before taking a seat at the large conference table. Diane sat beside me, projecting confident professionalism. The mediator, a former family court judge named Richard Gannon, began by outlining ground rules. This is not a courtroom, and I am not here to make rulings. My role is to help you find a resolution that addresses everyone's concerns while prioritizing the well-being of the children involved. Nothing said here can be used in court if mediation fails. He then asked each party to state their desired outcome. My parents' attorney spoke first. The bishops simply want to maintain a meaningful relationship with their grandchildren. They've been deeply involved in Ethan and Sophie's lives from birth and believe continued contact is in the children's best interest. They're willing to agree to supervised visitation initially if that would address Mrs. Carlisle's concerns. When my turn came, Diane and I had agreed I would speak for myself. I took a deep breath, looking directly at my parents for the first time in weeks. What I want is for my children to grow up feeling valued, accepted, and loved for exactly who they are. Not constantly compared to their cousins, not criticized for being too energetic or undisciplined, not made to feel like they're somehow less worthy of love and attention. That's why I set a boundary after you explicitly told me you preferred Catherine's children. My mother's face flushed with anger, but I continued. I never said you couldn't see Ethan and Sophie again. I said you needed to apologize to them and commit to treating them with the same respect and affection you show their cousins. Instead of addressing that very reasonable request, you launched a campaign of harassment and intimidation, culminating in a false report to CPS that traumatized my entire family. I looked directly at my father, whose stoic expression had begun to crack. So what I want now is different from what I wanted originally. Now I want legal protection from further harassment. I want acknowledgement of the harm you've caused. And I want any future contact with my children to be at my discretion, based on demonstrated changes in your behavior. The mediator nodded to Catherine. Mrs. Lawrence, you're not officially a party to this dispute, but you've asked to speak. Please go ahead. Catherine straightened, visibly nervous. I'm here because this conflict affects children too. They love their cousins. They're confused and upset by what's happening, and she hesitated, then continued more firmly. And I've realized that the dynamics in our family aren't healthy. The way we compare the children, the way we assign value based on achievement or behavior, it hurts all of them in different ways. My mother interrupted, her voice tight with controlled fury. Catherine, we discussed this. You're undermining our position. No, Mom, Catherine replied, her voice gaining strength. I'm telling the truth. You and Dad have always favored my children over Olivia's. You've always favored me over Olivia. It wasn't fair when we were growing up, and it's not fair now that we have children of our own. The mediator intervened as my mother started to respond. Mrs. Bishop, please allow your daughter to finish. Catherine took a shaky breath. What I want is for all of us to acknowledge the unhealthy patterns in our family and commit to changing them. I want my children to have a relationship with their cousins without being told they're somehow superior. I want us to find a way forward that respects Olivia's boundaries while allowing the possibility of healing. The room fell silent. My father stared at Catherine as if seeing a stranger. My mother's face had gone from flushed to ashen. For the first time, they were facing unified opposition from both their daughters, and they clearly had no script for this scenario. The mediator seized the moment. It seems to me that the core issue here isn't about grandparent rights at all. It's about acknowledging harmful patterns of favoritism and committing to healthier family dynamics. Would you agree, Mr. and Mrs. Bishop? My father looked at his attorney, who nodded slightly. We may have certain expectations about behavior that could be perceived as favoritism, he conceded reluctantly. Perceived? I couldn't help interjecting. You literally told me you prefer Catherine's children because they're better behaved. My mother's composure finally cracked. Well, they are. Is it our fault your children run wild while Catherine's know how to behave in public? Is it wrong to appreciate children who don't break things, who speak respectfully, who achieve academically? The mediator leaned forward. Mrs. Bishop, with respect, what you're describing is conditional love, caring for children based on their behavior, rather than simply because they are your grandchildren. That's the core issue your daughters are raising. This is ridiculous, my mother snapped. Of course we love all our grandchildren, but that doesn't mean we can't have standards. I met Catherine's eyes across the table, seeing in them the same realization I was having. Our parents were incapable of seeing the fundamental problem. In their worldview, love was inherently conditional, a reward for meeting expectations rather than a given. The mediation continued for hours, with proposals and counter-proposals, moments of tentative progress followed by sudden regressions. By late afternoon, it was clear we had reached an impasse. My parents would not acknowledge the harmful nature of their behavior or commit to meaningful change. They wanted access to the children on their terms, with no restrictions and no accountability. As the mediator prepared to end the session, my father made one final appeal, addressing me directly for the first time. Olivia, you're tearing this family apart over nothing but hurt feelings. After everything we've done for you, the financial support, the childcare when you needed it, the connections we've provided, this is how you repay us? By keeping our grandchildren from us? By turning your sister against us? What kind of daughter does that? His words hung in the air, the underlying threat clear. Continue this fight, and you'll be cast out of the family permanently. In the past, such a threat would have devastated me, sent me scrambling to make amends. But now, looking at my parents' rigid faces, understanding at last the transactional nature of their love, I felt only a deep, cleansing certainty. The kind of daughter who becomes a better parent than you were, I replied quietly. The kind who breaks the cycle. The mediation was officially declared unsuccessful. As we prepared to leave, my mother approached me one last time, her voice low enough that only I could hear. You think you've won because you got Catherine on your side. But you have no idea what you've started. If you force this to court, we'll make sure everyone knows what an ungrateful, unstable daughter you've always been. We'll bring up everything. Your teenage rebellion, that boy you dated in college that we had to pay off, the time you called me drunk after Sophie was born saying, you couldn't handle motherhood. We have decades of ammunition, Olivia. Are you sure you want to do this? I looked into her eyes, seeing not a mother but a stranger wielding memories like weapons. I'm not afraid of the truth, Mom. Not anymore. Are you? As I walked away, I knew we had reached the point of no return. The final confrontation wouldn't happen in a mediator's office or even a courtroom. It would come when my parents realized that their ultimate weapon, the threat of withdrawing their love and approval, had lost its power over me completely. What, I didn't know then was that forces were already in motion that would bring this conflict to a conclusion none of us could have anticipated, and that my parents would soon face a choice that would reveal, once and for all, whether there was any real love beneath their controlling facade. 1 week after the failed mediation, I sat in our attorney's office reviewing the documents for our court hearing, scheduled for the following month. The temporary restraining order had given us a brief respite from my parents' most aggressive tactics, but the looming court battle still cast a shadow over every aspect of our lives. "There's something you should see," Diane said, sliding a folder across her desk. "Catherine submitted this to the court yesterday." I opened the folder with trepidation, expecting another betrayal. Instead, I found a sworn affidavit from my sister, detailing years of disparate treatment between our children, confirming the conversation where our parents had explicitly stated their preference for her children and acknowledging the pattern of financial control they had exercised over both of us. "She's testifying against them?" I asked, stunned by this unexpected development. Diane nodded, her expression carefully neutral. "It appears so. This significantly strengthens our position. Catherine has been the beneficiary of their favoritism. She has no obvious motivation to lie about it." I read through the document again, trying to process this seismic shift in family dynamics. In one section, Catherine described how our mother had once told her, "We have to be generous with Olivia because she needs more help. You're our secure investment, but she's our charity case." The words stung, but the fact that Catherine was finally acknowledging such painful truths felt like a strange kind of victory. That evening, as Mark and I discussed this new development, my phone lit up with a text from a number I didn't recognize. "Meet me at Riverside Park tomorrow, 10 a.m., by the old boathouse. Important. Dad." Mark looked concerned. It could be a trap, another attempt to create drama they can use in court. Or it could be a genuine attempt to talk, I countered, not entirely believing it myself. "Either way, I should go. I'll meet him in a public place, record everything, and leave at the first sign of manipulation." The next morning dawned crisp and clear, the park alive with joggers and families enjoying the weekend sunshine. I spotted my father sitting alone on a bench overlooking the river, looking older and more diminished than I remembered. He wore casual clothes rather than his usual business attire, and his normally perfect posture was slightly stooped. "Thank you for coming," he said as I sat beside him, leaving considerable space between us. "I wasn't sure you would." "I almost didn't," I admitted. "Why the secret meeting and burner phone?" He sighed, gazing out at the water. "Your mother doesn't know. I'm here. She's not well, Olivia. This conflict has taken a toll on her health, on both of us." I felt the familiar twinge of guilt, but pushed it aside. "I'm sorry to hear that, but using health concerns as leverage is exactly the kind of manipulation we're trying to break free from." To my surprise, he nodded. "I know. That's not why I asked you here." He paused, seeming to gather his thoughts. I read Catherine's affidavit. She showed it to me before submitting it. And? I braced myself for anger, accusations of betrayal. "And she's right," he said simply. "About all of it. The favoritism, the conditional love, the financial control." He turned to look at me directly. "I didn't see it that way until now. I thought we were just maintaining standards, encouraging excellence. I didn't realize how much damage we were causing." I studied his face, searching for signs of deception. Why the sudden insight? It wasn't sudden. It's been building since this whole mess started. But reading Catherine's statement, seeing our family through her eyes, even though she's always been our... He trailed off. "Your favorite," I finished for him. He winced, but nodded. "Yes, even Catherine, who benefited from our behavior, sees how wrong it was. That made me finally question everything." A silence fell between us, filled with decades of hurt and misunderstanding. Finally, my father spoke again, his voice uncharacteristically hesitant. "I'm dropping the lawsuit, Olivia. I've instructed our attorney to withdraw the petition for grandparent rights." I stared at him in disbelief. "Just like that? What about Mom?" "She doesn't agree," he admitted. "She wants to fight to the bitter end. But I've made my decision. I'm also transferring the cabin into your and Catherine's names. No strings attached. It was meant to be your inheritance anyway." "Why?" I asked, still suspicious of this dramatic reversal. He looked down at his hands, weathered and spotted with age. "Because I'm 74 years old, and I suddenly realized I might die without ever really knowing my grandchildren. Not as achievements or extensions of myself, but as the unique, wonderful people they are." His voice cracked slightly. "I don't want that. What are you asking for?" I kept my tone measured, unwilling to be drawn in by what might still be manipulation. "A chance," he said simply. "Not to pick up where we left off. Not to pretend nothing happened. But a chance to learn how to be the grandfather your children deserve, one who loves them unconditionally. And Mom? She's not ready for that conversation yet. This is just me, taking a first step." I considered his words carefully. "I need time to think about this." He nodded, standing to leave. "I understand. Whatever you decide, the lawsuit will be withdrawn by Monday. No conditions, no expectations." He hesitated, then added, "I am sorry, Livy. For all of it." As I watched him walk away, I felt conflicted. His apology seemed genuine, but decades of manipulation had made me wary of sudden changes of heart. I called Diane immediately to verify his claim about withdrawing the lawsuit, then spent the weekend discussing it with Mark. "What do you think?" I asked as we sat on our back porch Sunday evening, watching the children play in the yard. "Is this real or another tactic?" Mark considered the question carefully. "The lawsuit withdrawal is real. Diane confirmed it. The cabin transfer, too. Those are tangible actions, not just words." He watched Ethan teaching Sophie how to throw a frisbee, their laughter floating through the evening air. "Maybe your father really is having a genuine change of heart. And my mother?" "Not everyone can change," he said gently. "You might have to accept that your relationship with her may never heal." 3 days later, we received official confirmation that the grandparent visitation lawsuit had been withdrawn. The property transfer documents for the cabin arrived the following week, with no conditions or strings attached. A simple note accompanied them. "This belongs to you and your children. No expectations. Dad." A month passed with no contact from either of my parents. I heard through Catherine that our mother had retreated into angry silence, refusing to discuss the withdrawn lawsuit or my father's independent outreach. Catherine herself was navigating her own recalibrated relationship with our parents, setting boundaries while trying to maintain contact. "It's strange," she confessed during our first tentative lunch together, the beginning of our own healing process. "For the first time in my life, I'm not trying to be the perfect daughter. It's terrifying and liberating at the same time." As summer approached, I thought about the cabin by the lake, now co-owned by Catherine and me. The place that had been the site of so much family history, both good and bad, was now ours to redefine. "We should use it," Mark suggested one evening. "Reclaim it with new memories." After much thought, I texted my father, "We're taking the kids to the cabin next weekend. If you'd like to come for Saturday lunch, just you're welcome. No pressure either way." His response was simple. "I'd be honored. Thank you." That Saturday at the cabin was awkward, tentative, but also the beginning of something new. My father arrived with no gifts, no grand gestures, just a humble willingness to connect with Ethan and Sophie on their terms. He listened to Ethan's detailed explanation of his video game with genuine interest. He sat patiently while Sophie showed him her rock collection, admiring each one as if it were precious. When he left, he hugged me briefly. "Thank you for this chance," he whispered. "I won't waste it." Over the following months, we established a new, carefully structured relationship. My father would visit occasionally, always respectful of our boundaries, gradually earning back trust through consistency and respect rather than grand gestures or financial support. My mother remained distant, unable or unwilling to adjust to the new family dynamic. As for Catherine and me, we began the slow work of rebuilding our relationship without competition or comparison. Our children, once unwitting pawns in a toxic family system, now had regular cousin playdates free from the weight of expectations or favoritism. "Do you think Grandma will ever come around?" Ethan asked one evening after my father's visit. "I don't know, sweetheart," I answered honestly. "Some people find it very hard to change." "That's sad," he said, showing more compassion than my mother had ever managed. "But I'm glad Grandpa changed." "Me too," I replied, realizing I truly meant it. The family I had once known, hierarchical, conditional in its love, ruled by my mother's rigid standards and my father's silent acquiescence, was gone. In its place was something fragile, but real, a family rebuilt on honesty, boundaries, and the radical notion that love shouldn't have to be earned. My children would grow up knowing they were enough, exactly as they were. And in the end, that was worth every painful step of the journey. As I tucked Sophie into bed that night, she looked up at me with serious eyes. "Mom, are we still family with Grandma even though she doesn't come to see us?" I sat on the edge of her bed searching for the right words. "Family can mean different things, sweetheart. Sometimes it's the people you're born to, and sometimes it's the people who choose to love you the right way. The most important thing is that you're surrounded by people who love you for exactly who you are, not for what you do or how you behave. Like, you and Daddy and Ethan," she said confidently. "Like us," I agreed, kissing her forehead. "And like Aunt Catherine and your cousins, and even Grandpa, who's learning a new way to love. And maybe Grandma someday," she asked hopefully. "Maybe," I said, not wanting to extinguish her natural compassion. "But even if that never happens, you will always be enough, exactly as you are. You never have to earn love, Sophie. Real love is given freely." As I turned out her light, I realized those words were as much for the wounded child inside me as they were for my daughter. The cycle of conditional love that had defined my childhood had finally been broken. And in its place was the beginning of something healthier, something real. A family rebuilt on the foundation of acceptance rather than achievement, of boundaries rather than control, of love given freely rather than conditionally. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't complete, but it was authentic, and it was ours. And that was enough. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.